Are you fascinated by history? Are you Irish? You know, Connecticut has strong connections to Ireland's struggle for independence, and those connections are explored in a new book that we're going to talk about tonight. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. My guests are here tonight to talk about a new book that is close to their hearts, close to my heart. It captures a snapshot of the history of Ireland and its connection to Connecticut. So let me introduce you to my two guests. Here to my right is Patrick Mahoney. Patrick, thanks very much for being on the show. He's one of the co-authors of the book. And Vince McMahon. Vince, Vice President of the Connecticut Irish American Historical Society. Thank you both for being with me on the show tonight. I'm excited to be able to talk about this book and you know, share our Connecticut connections. So to get things started, Patrick, why don't you tell me right off the beginning, tell me about the book, what's it about, and particularly, where did you get the title?
Yeah, so interesting question. I suppose the book is kind of the culmination of what's been going on for the past year, which is the centenary celebrations of the 1916 Easter Rising, which you can't miss. And it's kind of Connecticut, the Historical Society here's contribution to these celebrations. So Neil and I kind of undertook this work, and the title actually came from the creative genius of Neil Hogan, who really said, we look at the soldier song of the Hour and the V, and there's this mention of those that came from a land beyond the wave. So why not look at those specifically who either settled in Connecticut, or even some of them are Connecticut-born of Irish descent, who contributed to this fight for independence for Ireland over quite a long time, as you see, 1798 to 1916.
Ed Patterson, friend of mine, executive producer of the Irish Film Festival, and also I know helping you talk about the book and get the word out. He was telling me the other day that about 20% of the population in Connecticut is either, all Irish or certainly connected, has some kind of Irish ancestry. I think that's fascinating. I think that's why I like living in Connecticut so much. So on the cover of the book, and we'll take a look at that right here, but the subtitle, it's From a Land Beyond the Wave, but the subtitle says, Connecticut's Irish Rebels, 1798 to 1916. So what is the significance of those 2 years, the bookends of those years? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, and it's almost a Herculean task for any historian or even writer to try and tackle a period that big. But I suppose the significance there is really there's almost the two bookends of the major Irish rebellions in the modern era. Being in 1798, you have the United Irishmen kind of make their failed attempt, and then in 1916, obviously Portig MacPierce and the crew kind of make a similar attempt in Dublin. So we, in kind of part of that commemoration, chose to go in those dates.
And I am fascinated by the fact that, okay, you've chosen two rebellions as the bookends for the story, and I don't know a whole lot about Irish history. I am eager to get into the book and learn more. But one of the things I do know about the Easter Rising in 1916 was that militarily it was a failure. And there was no social media then. So when the idea was, okay, call it off, we're not doing it now, not everybody got the word. So some of them showed up, for this rebellion, and the others did not, and the arms that were supposed to arrive did not arrive. And so there were a whole lot of reasons, a lot of factors that, because there was no way to let people know instantaneously the way we can do now, militarily it was a failure. But politically, that idea that the brutality of the English army on the Irish, when the word got out about all that had happened, and the letters of the men who were killed to their families, the poems they wrote, very, very clearly these were These were farmers, these were everyday men, these were family men who loved their country. They weren't infiltrators or military soldiers, and I think that turned the whole tide. And from, at least from my perspective, that's one of the big reasons that everything changed. That we look at pride in being Irish. And my great-grandmother would be very proud that I'm doing this show tonight, I'll tell you that. So, Vince, I want to talk with you now a minute, because you're vice president of the Connecticut Irish American Historical Society. And the reason that that's so important is your organization published the book. So why this book? I'm sure you get submissions for books all the time, but why this book and why now?
Well, I think this is about the sixth book we've published, actually. And we also publish a quarterly journal called the Shanachie, which is a Gaelic word for storyteller. But why now? Well, as Patrick said, this is the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising in 1916, which was primarily confined to Dublin, although it occurred in a few other places, like in Escorthy, County Wexford, and a couple of places in Meath and Galway. But for the most part, it was confined to Dublin. But what's interesting is that Wexford was one of the places that arose also. And of course, Wexford, Vinegar Hill, was the site of the 1798 rebellion. And in between those two bookends, there was a great deal of what I call a Celtic revival in Ireland. You know, you had the Land League, where more and more people got control over some of their land. You had the Dr. Douglas Hyde and the Gaelic League, where he was promoting Irish culture and Irish language. You had the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, founded, which again promoted ancient Gaelic games, football and hurling. But why now this book? I think we've thought about this for a while, and one of the things that concerned us was that the people who could give us not necessarily first-hand accounts, but accounts they might have heard from their father or their grandfather, these people are now dying off. And I thought it was very important, and the group thought it was very important, to do this now, before all of this history gets lost. Because of course, as each generation progresses, the story gets a little bit less reliable than it was in the past. Sure. So we were able to, and Patrick is one of the people that did these interviews, they were able to go and talk to grandsons and granddaughters of people, and in some cases sons and daughters, a few cases sons and daughters, of people who had fought in the rebellion. And quite frankly, I think that opportunity was passing us by if we hadn't taken advantage of it now. So we struck the iron while it was hot.
I'm glad you did. I'm very glad you did. You know, the book talks about the contributions of those in Connecticut, either born here or came here, to the struggle for Ireland's independence. And Patrick, I'm hoping that you can share a few of those examples with me, because I know I found them fascinating. There was certainly the things that one might expect, where someone here is sending some money back home to help support, you know, a family on a small farm. But there were other ways, other kinds of contributions that, I mean, I could see some of them being made into movies. Oh. So share some of those with us.
Yeah, the screenplays are definitely there,
yes,
I
they're
think.
There.
Somebody just needs to pick up on it. But yeah, I suppose it's interesting because, I mean, we look at all the different periods, and in looking at the different periods that the book covers, there's quite a few, as you say, different ways that people contributed. One of the ways, I suppose one of the specific ways that I find particularly interesting is in the immediacy after the American Civil War. You have large numbers of Irishmen who are veterans of the recent conflict. And when we start putting these events, you know, or these people into a global context, you start looking, okay, well, how old were they in the 1860s? They were, a lot of them, in their early 20s. And they were children when they left Ireland during the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger. And many of them kind of become involved with the Fenian Brotherhood, this kind of revolutionary organization, and they start going back to Ireland in mass numbers in the 1860s with this kind of intent of inciting a rebellion, which eventually they do in 1867, and, you know, as we see, is kind of a failure. But the details that we put into a lot of them, you know, kind of how they were pegged when they went back is, you know, even in one case that people can read in the book, they'll see the authorities picked them out as Irish Americans based on that they were wearing square-toed shoes as opposed to the European round shoes, and they would pick up on their kind of Americanized accents and start arresting them. So you have people like that actually traverse the Atlantic space, which is fascinating. But then, as you say, there are ones that are sending funds back. Some politically attempted to kind of make. I suppose they got involved in American politics with the intent of helping Ireland. And then in a more modern sense, and Vince kind of touched upon this in terms of, some of the I suppose, the grandchildren that we spoke of, talking about their grandparents. And in some cases, they actually impact Ireland as well during the period of the Civil War or even of the War of Independence. So things that really haven't been covered in a lot of other studies yet. So.
There was one in particular that I wanted to get a little bit of information. So I picked up something from the book about one Connecticut rebel who sent a whaling ship on a 10,000-mile voyage to rescue some Irishmen who had been sent to Australia as prisoners.
Yeah, Fremantle Jail in Western Australia was known as Van Diemen's Land at the time. And this fellow is New Havener, and by the way, he's well known in the New Haven area still. He's buried in St. Lawrence Cemetery. But he owned a small, I guess it was an ironworks type of business on the Mill River in New Haven. And he also was tied in, he was a Fenian. Now the Fenian movement was one of the movements that grew out of 1798. The Fenians were, approximately almost 100 years later, they were very active in the 1880s approximately. But he was very active in that movement, and so were people in New York and many other people in New Haven. But he actually helped put together a whaling ship, to outfit a whaling ship to rescue these people who were serving life sentences in Fremantle. They were never going to leave there. And he put together, and by the way, he not only helped put this thing together, he did something I think would be extraordinary. He had a house in New Haven. Now, they couldn't raise enough funds. They needed about $10,000. They raised about $5,000. So he said, you know what? I'll come up with the other $5,000. And you know what he did? He mortgaged his home. Now, can you imagine going home to your significant other and saying, hey, I just remortgaged the house so that we could fund this expedition, which quite frankly had very little hope of succeeding, but it did. And one of the reasons it succeeded was, well, first of all, they had a good captain and crew, but when they were leaving Australia, they were chased by a British gunboat. And the gunboat said, stop, or we'll shoot. And the guy says, he pointed at the flag, it was the American flag, he was flying the American flag. And he said, you shoot at us, you're shooting at America. And they didn't. And that was the only reason that he managed to get away. And it took like 6 or 8 months, I don't know if you remember exactly how long, but it was a 6 or 8 month trip. Supposedly a whaling trip, going from New Bedford, Massachusetts, to Australia, picking up these prisoners and bringing them back. And they actually landed in New York. So,
I see the movie. I can definitely see the movie.
It's called the Catalpa story, and the Catalpa was the name of the ship. And I'll tell you, it is well worth reading. If you read nothing else in this book, read that story. And by the way, that same man was connected with John P. Holland. And Holland was in my neighborhood back in Ireland, back in the West of Clare. Now, he was much older than I was. He was an adult in the 1880s. But in any case, he developed a submarine. And that submarine, one of the guys who helped finance that submarine the trials on the Mill River in New Haven was Reynolds. And later on, Holland, he didn't raise enough money to do it privately. The idea was to harass British shipping. He didn't raise enough money, but along came the American Navy and said, we're interested in submarine warfare. And he got a contract to build the first submarine for the American Navy.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And it was called the John P. Holland.
For heaven's sakes. And here we are with, the huge sub-industry here in Connecticut.
Right in Groton.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. I also found one of the little tidbits in the book, this was the other one I wanted to talk about, that there was an immigrant from County Tyrone who earned a law degree at Yale. He was elected to Congress, and he proposed that the United States buy Ireland and make it a state. Obviously, that didn't happen, but I think that would be really cool. Hindsight, change history. That would be really nice. So, in terms of stories like this, one of the things I love about the book is that it has a lot of photos in it. And there's one particular photo that I wanted to show right now. And we're seeing a group of men. And I love being able to see the clothing, the time period. So we'll pick that up here for a minute. But Patrick, I wanted to ask you, the men in the photo, who are they? And what's the significance of this photo?
Yeah, so the photo actually, as you'll see, in the kind of foreground there is actually Eamon de Valera on his kind of very celebrated tour of the United States in 1919 and 1920.
He's the tallest man in the group.
The long fellow, as they say, and this is when he's actually coming out of one of the municipal buildings in Hartford. And the I suppose significance of where this picture really ties into our story, beyond the fact that we really kind of unpack de Valera's connections with Hartford, including that the person, for those that don't know, Eamon de Valera is actually born in the United States, in New York, and he's brought back to Ireland as a young boy after his father dies. And the man that brought him back, his uncle, a Limerick native, was actually an adopted Connecticut man. And his first cousin actually was one of the people that welcomed him back to the city all these years later, after he's kind of risen to fame. But the picture was sent after he'd already gone back to Ireland from his trip by one Dan McAuliffe, who was a Hartford policeman, and he was on the welcoming committee, and actually was the head of security detail. So McAuliffe is actually the kind of fourth one from the left in the back. And he sends it back and says, "To the President of the Irish Republic, Daniel McAuliffe, Sinn Féin." So kind of marking himself as in line with the political movement that was going on in Ireland at the time. And it's, I suppose, significant because it ties in a number of the different stories that come into play during the latter portion of the book, particularly with regard to Hartford and its connections to Irish republicanism.
I love the fact that we have such a very distinct Hartford connection, to the whole story. So yeah, this is really nice. It's not theoretical. It's real. It's real people, real, connections to our capital and to the surrounding community. The book itself. I mean, this is this is a sizable book. Patrick, when you're undertaking, you and Neil Hogan, because you're the two co-authors, and Neil couldn't be with us today, but when you're undertaking a book of this size, what's the thought behind it initially? Are you writing, is the intent to write something scholarly, or is the intent to write something that will be accessible to anyone who is just interested in Irish history?
Yeah, I suppose the first thought is you think about it as a Janie Mac, what did I get myself into? But beyond that, I think that, all jokes aside, this is kind of the intent of this, because I do quite a bit of scholarly writing, during the day job. And this, I think, the best way to approach work like this is almost that it's kind of an encyclopedia of sorts. That there's a lot of works done that are very in-depth studies of things like the Catalpa rescue, but they don't really give the local perspective. So what we kind of sought to do was write for a popular audience that might be familiar with the other tales, but be unfamiliar of the local kind of connection, or just people from the community, places like Hartford or New Haven, or even Fairfield, that might see their town name in here and have no idea that people, their forebears, were connected, so deeply connected to the different kind of Irish revolutionary efforts. So really, for a general audience, very kind of wide-ranging.
Yeah. I'm glad you chose that perspective, because I will enjoy that. I will enjoy it thoroughly. When you were gathering the information, what did you have to eliminate? Because I'm sure there was, even though it's a sizable book, I know how the process works, and there must have been things you had to eliminate. How did you decide?
Yeah, there were definitely a few great tales that were probably left on the table.
Another book coming, maybe?
There could be, yeah. There's a lot that happens after really 1923 is where it goes, even though the title says 1916. I suppose where we kind of made our decisions in terms of editing things out was that there was much more source work available, in terms of a historical book, for the kind of more modern things like the War of Independence and the Civil War than there were for 1798 and the end of the 18th century, surely because there was a lot more Irish people living in Connecticut at that time, and they were actually leaving traces of what they were doing. So I think those earlier tales were probably weeded out, if anything was.
Is there anything that you're still searching for, or that you would have wanted for this particular book for this time period?
Yeah, great question. I think, and I find this, any historical study I'm working on, I think you have to, I suppose you're always finding new sources and always finding kind of areas where you can expound upon the story.
Yeah.
And with a work that's covering such a big time frame, you can really go quite a bit more in depth on a lot of these tales than we were even able to, just because of the page count.
Sure.
So I think, the plight of the historian, you can always go back and rewrite it as just one particular tale and really go into a lot more detail than we were able to, in this particular project.
Well, I think one of the things that's nice too is that now with social media and the whole idea of writing blogs, and you can put things on Facebook. In fact, I know right now there's no website yet for the book. This is very fresh. It's just coming on the market. But there is a Facebook page where people will be able to go and get some information, and they can certainly always go to the website for the Connecticut Irish American Historical Society and find some information there. For one of the things that always occurs to me in writing something where we're dealing with real people, did you experience any kind of an emotional moment in creating this book? Maybe you're Irish and this is Irish history and there's struggles in here.
Yeah, I suppose, and it's kind of interesting because my own family actually features in the text to a certain extent because particularly my dad's family was quite involved in the War of Independence, and that was kind of one of the reasons I suppose that we ended up here, was the outbreak of the Civil War, some of the events there. But it actually wasn't my own family where emotions would have really come into the writing. I was able to kind of, disassociate myself from that in a real sense. But it was actually the story of Dan McAuliffe, who I mentioned before, with Eamon de Valera, and kind of uncovering that tale and looking into it. I felt like I was almost an extended member of the family, finding out the different characters, and there was quite a bit of oral history involved in doing that particular tale. And the individual who I suppose was the biggest contributor of his grandchildren actually passed away just as we were finishing the book. He'd been a real pillar of the Irish community in Hartford himself, and I had no idea that he had this great, very rich, revolutionary background in his family. And so kind of finding that out and even, really building a friendship as we're really writing the book and things with him. I suppose that was emotional, just in terms of finishing the text and seeing his reaction and his pride. And the grandson's name was John McAuliffe, kind of a long-time fire chief in Wethersfield, and really just a stand-up individual, very much like his grandfather. The principles you can see go down the line. So,
I think about the fact what it'll mean to them and to their family to know that someone in their family was honored, was remembered in a book like this. I mean, the contributions are endless of how this will ripple. So I understand also you have an introduction in here by Cormac O'Malley. I don't know how you manage that, but I'm trying to get him on the show. So that in itself too is significant. I mean, there's quite contributions in here. So I think in terms of successful things for the book, Vince, let me ask you first. I know success means different things to different people, but for this book, what does success look like?
Success for us, first of all, would be to have people read it, and read it with an understanding of some of the things that Patrick has just pointed out, that these are stories of real people. This is not, there are people that some of us know. I know a couple of people in New Haven, for example. In fact, my wife's uncle is one of the people is mentioned in the book. And, I think if we can, future historians or academics, look at this 100 years from now and say, wow, this is valuable information. I think that's our objective in the organization, is not only to uncover this kind of information, but to make it available to future generations. And for me, that really would be success, having it available to future generations, not just in hardcover or hard copy, but in digital format. Because we have found that from our working with Sacred Heart University, their digital commons, we found people from China sending us emails inquiring about further information on some of the stuff we have on the digital commons. And Patrick, you taught there for quite a while, I believe, too, also, a few years back. So We have a great relationship with Sacred Heart University, and they've been exceptionally helpful to us in terms of digitizing a lot of information, because we have archives, but books on shelves gathering dust doesn't help very much. You got to get them out there into the community and into the world community, really, and that's what I would like to see happen with the information here. It's somebody 100 years from now will be reading this in Shanghai or wherever.
What a great thought. What a great thought. And Patrick, let me ask you, what does success look like for the book?
Yeah, I suppose I would agree with Vince and even what he had said before about, getting these stories down. We have rich histories in really all the Irish communities in Connecticut, and as time goes and these stories aren't told, that rich history begins to become diluted. So I suppose just getting it down on paper, having the book get into people's hands, or as you say, in the digital space, is just a very important thing. So I suppose I would measure success in terms of that as well.
I think that's an important measurement. So I have one final question for both of you gentlemen. Speaking of the Shanachie, the Irish storyteller. So Vince, let me start with you. Give me some thoughts on the importance of story. About a minute.
Well, we're a culture because not much was written down in Ireland in the old days, because all through the 1700s we had the penal laws where people couldn't be educated.
Yeah.
But people went around from farmhouse to farmhouse and told stories. They were Shanachies. That's where the word comes from, actually. And not only did people go around and tell stories, but there were musicians and various nomadic type people, especially after the Great Hunger. People were driven out of their homes, they had nowhere to go. But if they could tell a good story, sing a song, play an instrument, they could go to the, they'd make a circuit of farmhouses, and each year they'd come back to the same farmhouse and they'd always be welcome. So I think, that tradition really is very important in Ireland, the oral tradition. And
Absolutely.
And it again, because of the oppression we suffered during the terrible years of the 1700s and the early 1800s and even the middle 1800s. I mean, the Great Hunger was devastating.
Well,
and that's
it's
one of the
honored.
reasons so many of these people came to Connecticut.
Sure.
The population of Ireland was cut in half.
Patrick, you have about the final 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah,
Importance of story.
I suppose I would agree with Vince very much there in that in terms of every culture has a way of telling stories and the importance that they place upon storytelling. And I think particularly within Irish culture, the idea of the Shanachie and the Bard is particularly there. So.
Well, I love knowing that I've met two Shanachies here right in person. This is awesome. And I want to thank you both for being on the show. Patrick Mahoney and Vince McMahon, your contributions to the book, and I look forward to sharing all of this information with the viewers. So I definitely want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank my crew. I have a special thank you to Bob Medic, who's a man I met on the street. He stopped me on the street to tell me how much he loves the show. So I thought that was really nice. And I love to close this show with the words of the fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, "There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories." So find your story, find a way to tell it, and join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email Zita at zitatv.com or write to Zita Christian, Page 1 TV, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut 06045-1515. You can watch this and other episodes of Page 1 on youtube.com/Zita3x3.